the second of three lectures that I typically give on the Vietnam War. I'll be focusing on the home front for the most part in this lecture. I'll probably deal with some other events as well, but mostly the home front. I'm going to try and be less detailed in this lecture than I was in the first, simply because I would like to get a student response to this lecture. Basically, your next assignment is going to be listen to this lecture and provide a response. And that response can simply be a comment about the lecture, hopefully an insightful one, or perhaps a question you have that I'll do my best to address. So I'm going to try and be less detailed, but that can be difficult with me because sometimes when I'm giving a lecture, a lot of things pop into my head from the various books and articles I've read over the years, some classes I've had. So sometimes I end up saying more than perhaps I should. But these are interesting things that I like to share, in my opinion. So, focusing on the home front, you can see by the title, A Nation Divided, which is actually, this is a title of one of the sections in chapter 16 of your digital text. I didn't have you read that section because I had you read a Khan Academy article instead. But if you want a further understanding of this event, of these events, I do recommend that you read that section. But one of the reasons why the nation becomes divided during the Vietnam War is arguably the draft. As the Vietnam War continues, and as President Johnson continues to escalate involvement in the war up to 500,000 troops by 1968, the military, the government becomes more increasingly reliant upon the draft. Now, the draft, as you should know at this point in your academic career, is overseen by the selective service system. And the way it worked in the 60s during the Vietnam War was all males had to register at their local draft boards when they turned 18. Now, all males still have to register for selective service. You go to the selective service website and you can do it online, or you can go to your post office and do it these days. There are consequences if you don't. There are various federal programs and benefits that you can be denied, and there is even fines and possible jail time involved for those who resist registering for selective service. So I encourage you to do so, gentlemen, when you turn 18. And there is even some discussion of women having to register for that draft eventually, since they are not now denied the opportunity to serve in combat roles. We'll see what happens with that in the future. Now, here's the thing. The possibility of a draft is very remote in our present circumstances, 2020. And some of that is due to the Vietnam War. For all intents and purposes, the Vietnam War ended the reliance of the federal government upon the draft to get men to serve because of the unpopularity of it, quite frankly. And we have a very large volunteer professional army now, or military, I should say. So the likelihood of a draft is very remote. They just still have people registered just in case. There could be a national crisis in which that would be needed, but their likelihood is remote. Now, when you're registered for it in the 60s for Vietnam, here's the ages that were going to be called to serve. Ages 18 to 26 could be called to serve, to register for the draft. Now, because this war was not nearly as popular or seen as necessary as, say, World War II, and you didn't have the volunteer enlistment rates that you had during World War II, although even in World War II there was a reliance upon the draft as well, you're going to see more draft avoidance during Vietnam. And there are several ways in which a person could avoid the draft. One is simply through medical deferment. If you had some type of physical disability that prevented you from serving in the military, then you would not be expected to serve. Now, often that was very legitimate. There were men who got out of the draft by going to see a sympathetic doctor, and the doctor, quite frankly, made up a medical condition and they didn't have to serve. So that was one way in which you could avoid it. Another way in which you could have not necessarily avoid the service, but not have to go to Vietnam, was join the National Guard or be in the Coast Guard. So you could join another branch of service that is not sent abroad. And in those days, the National Guard was not. Now that has changed. The National Guard has been sent abroad in recent American conflicts, probably because we don't rely on a draft anymore, and that is the expectation of joining the National Guard now, that you could be sent abroad to help in military missions. So that has changed. But during the Vietnam War, you could join the National Guard and stay home. Another way, and perhaps maybe the most controversial way, and something that will fuel the protests of the Vietnam War, is college deferment. If you got accepted into college, you could get out of the draft just by being accepted. The thinking was, you've been accepted into college, that's an academic achievement, and we're going to need you to serve the country in other ways. The problem with that is we see that 80% of soldiers, as you see by the statistic here, 80% of soldiers were going to be from lower economic levels and disproportionately minority. Because, quite frankly, the college opportunity was more for white families. They were the ones that had more access to wealth. The GI Bill, when it was first initiated post-World War II, served mostly white males. So they had more of the likelihood to go to college. College costs money. Okay, even if you have good grades, college can cost you money, and there weren't as many opportunities scholarship-wise in these years. So college deferment was causing this to truly be what came to be called a rich man's war, poor man's fight. Now, that's not the first time we've seen that phrase in relation to U.S. conflicts. We saw it during the Civil War, when the North and the South both used a draft, and both had ways in which the rich, essentially, those with wealth, could get out of conflict. In the North, you could pay a man to take your service. In the South, if you were a slaveholder, you were expected to not be subject to the draft because you needed to stay home and manage the plantation. So you could hire a substitute as well. So this isn't the first time we've seen this criticism where the Vietnam War is a rich man's war, poor man's fight. Even nowadays, our military is arguably disproportionately lower class because middle to upper class families tend to have more opportunities. They can not look at the military as an option and simply go to college or a trade school. Whereas someone who is lower class may want to take advantage of those military benefits, which are outstanding, right? The fact that the military can pay for college for people is absolutely fantastic. But more lower class people are going to take advantage of that. So even now, our military is arguably disproportionately lower to working class people who serve. Not exclusively, of course, but still a large percentage. But this is going to lend itself to some of the controversy of the Vietnam War, the fact that you're sending lower class people to go fight this war that is going to be increasingly less popular as it continues. Now, of course, if you're doing that, then you're going to have a disproportionate minority service because we see the minority members of minority citizenship in the United States, be it African American or Hispanic or what have you, tend to be in the lower to working class. And that is still the case even now, even when we have a good economy. For example, our unemployment rate has been 4% recently. Even among minorities, it was double that, so it was at 8%. Okay, and there's still wage disparities even now, even though things have improved greatly. So what we're seeing in Vietnam, because it's mostly a lower class war in terms of who's experiencing the combat, we're seeing a disproportionate participation by the minority members of our society. And we see that particularly with our African American population. If you look at this first statistic, right, what we see happening is African Americans making up 10% of the U.S. population, but African American males are accounting for 20% of U.S. combat deaths. And you have to think, once again, what is going on in the 60s, 50s, a very strong civil rights movement. And so you've got the citizenry being denied full citizenship at home in the United States, still in the 60s, still fighting for equality of opportunity, equality of citizenship rights, but yet that's the percentage of, our highest percentage of citizens, or not our highest percentage, but a disproportionate percentage of citizens that are dying in the war. And this isn't unusual. African Americans have a very strong volunteer enlistment rate in every war in United States history. You could research this very easily. And it's kind of tragic that in some respects they're our most exploited citizens, but yet their military record is very strong despite the adverse conditions that they're often put in and the unfair treatment they receive. And Vietnam is once again, this is occurring. And you can imagine with the civil rights movement going on, there are leaders who are speaking out against this. I mentioned previously that Martin Luther King could be seen as a little bit maybe more radical towards the end of his life. In 1967, he's a little more confrontational in his speeches, and he will speak out against this in 1967. He will talk about how he is very frustrated at the pace of change in the civil rights movement, even though great things have occurred by 67, particularly with the amount of African American men that are dying in Vietnam. And this will actually cause some tension between him and President Johnson. Their relationship will deteriorate somewhat in 1967. Now, the U.S., to their credit, will try to deal with this. They will try to correct this with a draft lottery in 1969, which makes the draft more fair in terms of you're picking by dates. You're not necessarily picking by the alphabet, so to speak. Right? You're picking by it's more random. Bad explanation there, but they're using a draft lottery where basically birth dates are chosen, and that does seem to make things a little bit more proportionate. So that's a reform that comes about with the draft. And the other thing that's going to happen later on with the draft is the removal of college deferment to some degree, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now, concerning African Americans serving in Vietnam, unfortunately, there could still be racial tension within the combat units, within platoons. Now, here's the thing: that tension would exist in the platoons when combat was not occurring, when they were back at the bases, things like that, but not in battle. Not in battle. If you read books about combat in Vietnam and maybe about combat and war in general, the one thing you learn is that when these men serve together at the front, all of that racial tension melts away. There is a brotherhood that develops, a comradeship that develops when you get to the front and you're in battle, because you are dependent upon each other for survival. And I think this image here can help demonstrate that, which it looks like we've got two soldiers, one white and one black, helping another black soldier who's been injured. And there's several books that deal with this issue. Philip Caputo's book, A Rumor of War, is fantastic. Joseph Galloway wrote a war called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. I want to repeat to my students that soldiers in Vietnam fought as bravely in any conflict, as bravely in Vietnam as any conflict in American history. It was just a very difficult war to win, and the strategies of some of the leadership were very problematic. And let me just give you one quick example of that. Remember, the concept of victory in Vietnam is not based on a front. It's not based on conquering a piece of territory and holding on to it. What becomes the reason for victory is body count. Right? So what happens is commanders would send a platoon out to patrol, or they would send them out to take a hill, and these hills would have numbers like Hill 246 or something like that. These men would fight courageously, sacrifice, die, risk their lives for each other, take a hill, kill a lot of Viet Cong in the process, take their body count numbers for some type of victory. Then they would leave that hill. And then what would happen is the Viet Cong would come right back. So imagine the frustration in that. So what you have to think about here is our soldiers are fighting very bravely, winning most of the battles they fought in, but they're not winning the war. So just keep that in mind, that when we don't lose the Vietnam War because of how our troops fought. Our troops fought very courageously. And when they were at the front, that's when this racial tension melted away. Unfortunately, it still sometimes existed in the platoon. You draft a black man from, say, Harlem, right, in New York, and a white man from, say, Montgomery, Alabama, right? There's going to be tension, but often not in battle. Another key group to mention in Vietnam is women, which your text does briefly mention. Women in the 1960s did not see combat. That is not the case now. Women who are qualified can experience combat in war. During Vietnam, their role will mostly be as women. You'll have 10,000 serve as women, and many more will volunteer for other organizations such as the Red Cross or the USO, United Services Organization. The United Services Organization would do things for the troops, support type things, including putting on shows with entertainment, things like that. Incredibly valuable role. And please always remember that women who serve as nurses often see some pretty ugly things, right? They experience a lot. Indeed, it's not unusual for women nurses who help save lives or saw lives end, often in tragic, disfigured ways. It's not unusual for them to experience PTSD as the end of the conflict as well. So, an incredibly valuable role. Okay, protest. So, protest. Vietnam is arguably the most protested war in American history. Every war in the United States history has had some degree of protest. Even World War II had a little bit, but not much. Vietnam will be heavily protested. And what we see is a growing movement. Now, this movement is often known as the New Left. Now, the New Left is a growing youth movement, and they're demanding sweeping changes in U.S. society, as they call it. The reason why it's called the New Left is because the New Left is critical of what they would call the liberal elite, who they don't see as advocating enough change or not moving quickly enough. So the New Left is a growing movement. They're not advocating communism, they're not advocating socialism, but they are advocating rapid change. They want the pace of civil rights to increase. They want their voices to be heard more. And that's going to transform into a strong anti-war movement. Some groups that are prevalent with the New Left are SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Their focus is on the corruption that they see. They're kind of disenchanted with the consumerist, conformist society that had grown out of the 50s. And they're upset with the power of corporations and their control over American society. And they want to restore participatory democracy. They're very big on individual freedom, individual participation in government. Okay, they want the obstacles to voting to be very minimum, for example. Okay, and so these are the movements that they're leading. And once again, the 60s, this is a movement, a time period of great change, reform, civil rights movement, so on and so forth. These groups are going to be part of that. Another group to mention is the FSM, the Free Speech Movement. They, along with the SDS, really the origins of these organizations begin on college campuses. They're upset with kind of the restrictions that are occurring on college campuses. They don't like the fact that you go to college and there's this movement by college leadership to really restrict their personal lives. They feel that they're adults now and they should be able to say more things and have more freedom of choice in what they do. So that's part of the movement. So it evolves into, so it's a movement that begins with, some discontent with what's going on in college campuses in terms of how their lives are restricted, but that broadens to other issues, whether it be civil rights or anti-war. Okay, so they initially dealt with campus issues and then they became more focused upon anti-war protests. I'll actually bring these groups up again in the next chapter and we deal a little bit more with the counterculture movement. Okay, so it's difficult to mention every protest, and I'm just going to try and highlight a couple here. But there is a March on Washington in April of 1965. Okay. And if you notice the number here, 20,000, that's a very strong anti-war protest. Now remember, the March on Washington for civil rights and economic equality that occurred in 1963, in which Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, there were 250,000 people who participated in that march. So a much greater number than what we see here in 65, but still 20,000. That's a very large number of people to march on Washington. And some of that is in relation to the fact that LBJ is continuing to escalate the conflict. Now, in 1964, Johnson wins re-election in a landslide, the largest presidential victory in United States history in 1964 over Barry Goldwater. And some of the reasons why he won that was he was talking about keeping, not escalating the conflict and keeping um, U.S. boys, as he called it, out of the war. That's not happening in 65. Escalation is occurring, Operation Rolling Thunder, troop numbers increasing. So some of that, excuse me, some of that is causing the anti-war protest. And in 1966, when it gets a little more personal, right? 1966, when college students are more directly affected by the draft, that's when we start to see protests accelerate greatly. Okay, because now you don't have that college deferment. So maybe some college students who really didn't care about this issue, had bigger things to worry about, like studying for exams, right? Now all of a sudden, they're going to be more interested because this issue is directly affecting them in 1966. Now, the college deferment isn't completely taken away in 1966, but you had to maintain good academic standing. Now, that's some pressure, right? Hey, you better get good grades or you're going to be drafted, okay? Well, that affects a lot of kids, and so we're going to see protests continue to accelerate. Okay, reasons for protests. So, what are the protesters saying? What are they upset about? Well, a few different things. Their argument is that Vietnam was a civil war. It was a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It's their civil war. It's their issues. It's their problem or challenge, so to speak, to determine who should lead. So therefore, why are we getting involved? We had our own civil war in the 1860s. Let them have their civil war in the 1960s and resolve it. And then when it's over, we'll see. We'll figure out how we want to help or work with that leadership. That was their argument. Why are we sending young American men over to die in a war that is a civil war? It's been going on for a very long time and really is none of our business. They had seen at this point, and media coverage is very key, right? But also what you learn on college campuses and things like that is very key. The South Vietnamese, what they had seen is that the South Vietnamese leadership was as oppressive as the North, and there's a lot of evidence of this. So think back to Ngo Dinh Diem and oppressing the Buddhists, and Buddhists burning themselves alive because they couldn't practice their faith. And the example I gave in the last lecture is, imagine if our current president said we couldn't practice Christianity anymore. Imagine the uprising that would occur. And South Vietnamese leadership is seen as corrupt, and they've taken away civil liberties, and the elections seem to be corrupt. And so there is some strong argumentation here as to, it's not that the North Vietnamese government isn't oppressive to those who oppose it, but it's that the South Vietnamese oppressive is too. So why are we there? Well, let the Vietnamese people resolve this. Protesters also saw this as another example of U.S. imperialism. The United States had taken territories throughout its history, and typically when it did that, things didn't work out well for the indigenous peoples. It was all about enriching the United States and those who already had wealth. And here, this is another example of that. That it's not about stopping communism. It's not about helping the Vietnamese people. It's about us furthering our own interests. We need to stop doing that if we're truly to be a great democracy, is the argument of the protesters. Another argument was you just can't police the whole world. Think back to the Truman Doctrine and the Doctrine of Containment. The Truman Doctrine said the United States was going to help any nation resisting subjugation. The protesters are like, that's kind of a ridiculous requirement. We can't be involved everywhere all the time. Why are we involved in this nation that doesn't seem to have any direct threat upon the United States? If you look at American history and wars that the American people have supported, particularly World War II, what they saw was a direct threat, a threat to their freedom, a direct threat to their way of life. The American people just aren't seeing that with Vietnam, and therefore they're having difficulty supporting it. And then the other argument is it's morally unjust. Some of the things that are occurring in Vietnam, in which we are carrying out search and destroy missions. Students have read about the My Lai massacre at this point. American people are going to find out about that in 1968. There are things that U.S. troops are doing that aren't seen as helping the Vietnamese people. Indeed, in some cases, it seems like we're terrorizing them when we're destroying their villages and moving them out. The body count is going to help contribute to atrocities. When you have a body count as a reason for victory, then what's going to happen is you're going to encourage indiscriminate firing and killing. And what's happening is there are times we are killing civilians, quite frankly, lots of times, and we're counting them as VC. And so as protesters find out these things, they tend to think of this war as morally unjust. Not only from that perspective, but also from what it seems to be turning our young men into. Good guys who enlisted to serve, who all of a sudden are starting to look like bad guys in some situations. So they're arguing the moral injustice. There's a great quote about war. It can bring out the best in a person in terms of courage and sacrifice, but it can also bring out the worst in terms of the killing that goes on. Okay, so the protests, as the war goes on, the protest movement continues to grow, including things like popular song. There'll be a lot of great, 1960s is a great era for rock music. If you're a rock and roll fan like I am, there are still songs that you listen to quite regularly from this era. And popular music is often a reflection of what's going on in society. One of the assignments I'm going to have you do this week is to actually look up a protest song and share some of the lyrics and interpret what's going on in that song, just as a kind of a fun primary source activity. Anyway, and that could be from any decade. I'm curious to see if you'll bring up any songs that are dealing with current issues now. But more on that later this week. So popular music is just, there are several songs being created in this time period. Woodstock will occur in 1969, of course, in which several bands appear. Several great rock bands like The Who and Janis Joplin and several others, Jimi Hendrix. And each of those bands typically has a song that can be seen as a song that is about peace and protesting the war in Vietnam. In this picture here, you see Country Joe. Country Joe had a song, his band was called Country Joe and the Fish. And what's interesting about Joe, if I remember correctly, I think Joe McDonald, I think was his full name. What's interesting about him is that he's a Vietnam veteran. So he's a Vietnam veteran who comes home and becomes a protester. And that happened quite frequently. Now, the majority of veterans that came home from the war did not become protesters, but many did because they were disillusioned with what they had experienced at the war. And they came home and actually joined protest movements. One of you had to read the book Born on the 4th of July, which is the story of a Vietnam veteran who did this. So this is Country Joe, and probably his most famous song is Fixin' to Die Rag, which is an anti-Vietnam War song. And the typical chant, as you see here, forgive me, my students, but the typical chant was, hell no, we won't go, in which the burning of draft cards and so on and so forth was encouraged. Okay, we continue to see demonstrations. Here we see a demonstration at Lincoln Memorial in 1967. These were meant to be peaceful protests, but there were times they turned violent. As a matter of fact, in 67 is when some protesters marched to the Pentagon. And they actually marched to the Pentagon. Their goal was to get inside the Pentagon. And they faced some tear gas and some reprisals by military police and those protecting the Pentagon. So that's one of the reasons why it turned violent. Maybe not the best decision by those protesters, but that's how committed to their cause they were. But you can see very large protests here in 1967. There is a scene in the movie Forrest Gump in which Forrest Gump gives a speech from this protest, if you've seen that movie. Now, these protests will continue. And look, we're into, now if you see, if this is the first time we've encountered President Nixon's name, and I asked you in a previous lecture to kind of keep track of how many presidents are affected by the Vietnam War. And we began with Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and now Nixon. So we're up to our 5th president who's affected by this conflict. And these protests will continue until President Nixon does away with the draft in January 1973. And so the last time we've seen a draft in United States history is 1972. And once again, the likelihood of ever seeing one again is pretty thin. Okay, so this is my last slide of this lecture today. But just a couple things to close with here. So what we see is with a nation divided, right? You've got the doves who are opposed to the war, who believe the U.S. should withdraw, and the hawks who continue the war and believe the United States should unleash full military might, nuclear weapons even if possible. And this isn't the first time we've seen these two terms. These two terms actually came about during the War of 1812, in which you had Doves who opposed the War of 1812, going to war with Britain again, and the Hawks who were for it. So that's the first time we saw those terms. Now, here's the thing. I've been talking to you about an increase in protests, and there's a few events briefly mentioned. Okay, an acceleration of protests definitely occurred in United States history. But even by 1967, most opinion polls, a majority still supported the war and considered protests disloyal. If you're a protester, you're automatically anti-American. I don't think that's ever really truly the case, but that's what people who are anti-protests or dissent tend to say. You can make arguments the other way, that the protest is American, but these are some of the back and forth arguments that occur. So by 1967, a majority is still supporting the war. There are even counter-protests in which people march in support of the Vietnam War, okay, stating that, love it or leave it, all those types of phrases about that occurred by protesters. So that's 1967. 1968, that's going to start to change. The opinion polls are going to go the other way. And I'll try and account for why that occurs in my last lecture of this unit. I'll be posting that at a later date. But one of the things that's going to cause that to occur is the Tet Offensive, which I will begin with in my next lecture. As always, thank you for your attention. I do expect a comment or question in response to this lecture. Please make sure you do that, and I will try to comment on it, time permitting. Thank you for your attention.